We are living in remarkable times. The Word of God is being fulfilled. As the sirens faded in Gaza and the world's cameras captured a historic handshake, one name once again dominated the headlines. Jared Kushner, the silent architect of peace. But what if what the world celebrates as diplomacy is actually the prelude to prophecy? Daniel 9:27 speaks of a leader who will confirm a covenant with many. And today, more than 2,000 years later, that line seems to be written once again. While the headlines of the world celebrated a new peace pact in the Middle East, one man watched silently from the second row. He didn't raise his voice or seek cameras, yet it was clear that without him, the agreement might never have happened. His name, Jared Kushner. To some, he is a businessman. To others, the invisible architect of a new diplomatic era. But for those who read history through the eyes of prophecy, his figure awakens something beyond admiration. It stirs ancient questions. Jared was born in New Jersey, into an Orthodox Jewish family accustomed to quiet power. He grew up surrounded by books, temples, and conversations about politics and business. From an early age, he stood out for his composure, a man who doesn't need to shout to be heard. By 30, he was already running his father's real estate empire and owned a prominent New York newspaper. His life seemed destined for business success, until he crossed paths with the Trump family. In 2009, he married Ivanka Trump, and without realizing it, stepped directly into the heart of global power. When Donald Trump became president, he appointed his son-in-law as senior advisor to the White House. The decision puzzled many. How could an investor with no political experience take on the world's most complex diplomatic challenge, the conflict between Israel and the Arab world? Yet what seemed like a risky bet became a strategic move. Kushner didn't act like a traditional politician. He wasn't seeking speeches, he was seeking results. While diplomats spoke in front of microphones, he operated behind closed doors, where history is truly made. His approach was different from all his predecessors. Instead of promising ideals, he offered benefits. Instead of insisting on borders, he spoke of opportunities. He believed peace should be built through economy, not ideology. That pragmatic formula broke down walls that decades of politics couldn't move. For 3 years, he held discreet meetings with Arab and Israeli leaders, weaving a network of trust that few understood at first. His method was meticulous. Listen, understand, wait, and finally act. On August 13, 2020, the world awoke to what seemed impossible. Israel and the United Arab Emirates had signed a historic peace treaty, the first in more than 25 years between Israel and an Arab nation. Days later, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan joined. It was the birth of the Abraham Accords, a name that evoked the patriarch shared by the 3 great monotheistic faiths. Under that spiritual banner, Jews, Christians, and Muslims gathered once again, not at an altar, but at a diplomatic table. During the official ceremony in the White House gardens, leaders raised the signed documents before the cameras. Behind them, with a serene expression, Jared Kushner watched as if seeing a long-awaited plan fulfilled. The press called it the diplomatic miracle of the 21st century. Analysts worldwide hailed him as a strategic genius, capable of uniting what others had divided for generations. But in certain spiritual circles, the echo was different. The words of Daniel 9:27 began to resound, "And he shall confirm a covenant with many." The similarity was unsettling. A leader achieving a covenant with many. A region long at war suddenly speaking of peace and security. A Jewish mediator accepted among nations. the most attentive believers began to ask if what the world celebrated as diplomacy was, in fact, a prophetic sign. Kushner, perhaps unknowingly, had touched an ancient chord. He wasn't a conqueror, yet he achieved what neither sword nor politics could, reconciling historic enemies under a shared purpose. From that day on, his name became linked to Abraham, Israel, and the word covenant. After leaving the White House, he founded Affinity Partners, a global investment firm that soon partnered with the same nations that had signed the peace. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, and Israel reappeared within his sphere of influence. Politics turned into economics, and diplomacy into investment. It seemed as if he had retired, but in truth, he was still moving the pieces from another board. His power no longer depended on a title, but on his ability to unite interests. Many thought his role would end there. Yet those who follow prophecy know that certain figures disappear for a time, only to return at the appointed moment. And that moment, observers say, has come again, because every time the world stands on the edge of chaos, Jared Kushner's name resurfaces in the headlines, as if history itself were calling him back. His profile fits the description of the diplomatic prince Daniel foresaw, a man who conquers not with weapons, but with agreements, who doesn't threaten, but persuades, who rules not through power, but through influence. There are no religious promises in his speeches, yet every step he takes seems to carry a spiritual echo. He speaks of reconstruction, cooperation, and the future, and behind those words, many discern something deeper, a language of political redemption that sounds hauntingly familiar to ancient texts at international forums. He is presented as the silent mediator. In religious conferences, his name is mentioned with caution, for his figure evokes both hope and unease. What sets Jared Kushner apart is not his visible power, but the sense that his rise follows a script written long ago. His moves seem deliberate, almost prophetic. He doesn't seek applause, yet every step he takes makes headlines. He doesn't preach, yet his work echoes in the realm of faith. In his silence lies strategy, and in his restraint, mystery. Today, as his journey is analyzed, many admit there is no other figure in modern politics with such a singular position. A practicing Jew, respected by Israel, heard by Arab nations, and supported by Western powers, he represents, without declaring it, the embodiment of a global system longing for peace and prosperity. October 13th, 2025, dawned with news that spread across the globe within hours. Israel and Hamas had signed a permanent ceasefire. After years of clashes, the echo of explosions was replaced by the murmur of journalists and the sound of camera flashes. Screens around the world replayed the same scene: exhausted leaders, intertwined flags, and a document held by trembling hands. International outlets such as Reuters, ABC News Australia, and the Times of Israel confirmed that Jared Kushner had taken part in private talks between officials from Israel, Egypt, and Qatar. He was described as the silent mediator, the one who achieves the impossible without needing to appear on stage. The agreement, called the Middle East Peace and Security Initiative, consisted of 3 concrete steps. First, an immediate ceasefire supervised by the United States and Egypt. Second, an unprecedented humanitarian exchange. 20 Israeli hostages were released in exchange for 1,900 Palestinian prisoners. And third, the opening of international corridors for the reconstruction of Gaza, financed by a joint fund from Saudi Arabia, France, and the European Union. News broadcasts showed Israeli families embracing their loved ones as buses crossed the border carrying freed Palestinian prisoners. The contrast was striking. Tears of relief on one side, restrained joy on the other. The world breathed a moment of hope. Yet those who observe events with spiritual discernment saw not just a treaty, they saw a sign. Jared Kushner did not represent any government, yet he seemed to be everywhere. He was consulted, quoted, and listened to. His words echoed louder than those of presidents. Time magazine released a cover featuring his image under the headline, "The Mediator Who Stopped a War." In Tel Aviv, his presence drew divided reactions. For some, he was a modern hero. For others, an enigma. The Israeli Prime Minister himself declared, "If Hamas keeps its word, so will we." And if this process endures, Kushner's name will be written in history. In Arab forums, leaders such as Mohammed bin Salman celebrated the pact as a diplomatic rebirth, while Iran rejected it outright, accusing Washington of using peace as a tool of control. While the headlines spoke of stability, Bible scholars began to revisit the ancient prophecies. The words of Daniel 9:27 resurfaced in theological debates, "And he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week." The parallels were impossible to ignore. A covenant with many. Not with one, but with a multinational coalition. A Jewish mediator respected by Israel and accepted by Arab nations. A promise of peace in a region historically impossible to stabilize. The more cautious theologians did not claim the fulfillment was literal, yet they acknowledged a preparation of the prophetic stage. It was as if every political step of the 21st century aligned, almost word for word, with the prophet's ancient visions. It wasn't the first time humanity celebrated a peace treaty, but it was the first time such a treaty carried a meaning so precisely tied to the biblical text. During his post-agreement tour, Kushner was received in Brussels, Riyadh, and Cairo. There, he pronounced a phrase that would make headlines worldwide. Peace is not a miracle, it's a collective decision. Today, the world has chosen to move forward into a new era. For political analysts, it was an inspiring statement. For spiritual observers, an unsettling echo. In Christian forums and sermons, reflections began to spread about the prince who is to come, described by Daniel, not a military conqueror, but a strategist capable of uniting nations and promising global security. The figure matched precisely the modern image of Kushner. Diplomatic, Jewish, respected, and seemingly neutral, the 2025 agreement triggered a domino effect around the world. The United Nations endorsed it with over 100 votes in favor. The United States announced the Gaza 2030 project, aimed at rebuilding the region through international investment. Europe celebrated a temporary drop in oil prices, and global markets reacted with optimism. For the first time in decades, it seemed that the endless conflict of the Middle East had found a point of balance. In Jerusalem, groups of believers gathered before the Western Wall, recalling the words of the Apostle Paul, when they say, "Peace and safety, sudden destruction will come upon them." The similarity between that verse and the language used by political leaders deeply unsettled many. Meanwhile, the media broadcast images of Kushner walking among diplomats, surrounded by cameras yet carrying the same calm demeanor as always. His posture, tone, and discretion had not changed. He seemed to be the same man who, in 2020, united nations under the name of Abraham. Only now, his influence was far greater. He was no longer the former president's son-in-law. He was a global mediator. His power did not depend on a position, but on reputation. Analysts from the Brookings Institution and the Council on Foreign Relations agreed on one point. Kushner had redefined modern diplomacy. Instead of ideology, he used pragmatism. Instead of pressure, he offered incentives. His method, rooted in economic cooperation, had turned conflict into commerce and rivalry into shared interest. Yet behind that apparent brilliance, theologians saw the exact pattern described by Daniel. a leader who will confirm a covenant with many, bringing a peace that will not last. In every religious forum, the same question arose: are we witnessing the literal fulfillment of prophecy or merely its prelude? None could say for certain, but all agreed. The prophetic clock had begun to move again. For if Scripture declares that, in the middle of the week, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering, then signing of a global pact might be only the first act in a drama still unfolding. The return of Jared Kushner was not merely the comeback of a diplomat. It was the reappearance of a symbol, and though no one can yet say whether his name will be recorded in history as that of the final mediator or simply the prelude to something greater, one thing is certain: his shadow now stretches across the prophetic stage. The year 2025 will not be remembered merely as the year of the Israel-Hamas agreement, but as the year when the word peace once again began to taste like prophecy. The words of the prophet Daniel were written more than 2,500 years ago, in a time when empires measured their power by sword and gold. Yet his message seems to have crossed the centuries to reflect itself on the screens of our age. Daniel spoke of a covenant with many, of a leader who would bring an apparent peace, and of a sequence of events that would mark the beginning of the end. What was once a mysterious vision for his contemporaries now appears to be taking shape with unsettling precision. And it is here that the mirror of prophecy begins to reveal its modern reflection. The key verse, Daniel 9:27, says, "He shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering." For centuries, theologians have wondered who this prince would be and what that covenant would mean. Some have interpreted it as a spiritual agreement, others as a political treaty. But what is striking is that the description in the text does not match a conqueror. It matches a mediator. It does not speak of war, but of diplomacy. It does not mention invasions, but alliances. And that is precisely the nature of the agreement, dominating today's headlines. What is most intriguing is not the covenant itself, but the context surrounding it. Daniel warned that this leader would arise during a time of crisis, when wars and devastations would seem endless. That same climate envelops our world today: chain conflicts, fragile alliances, powers divided by ambition and resources, and a weary humanity crying out for stability. History seems to repeat itself, only now with suits and microphones instead of swords and scrolls. And every speech about peace and security sounds like an indirect quotation from prophecy. Kushner, unintentionally or not, fits the profile of the leader Daniel described, not because he is a religious or messianic figure, but because of the pattern of his rise. His influence did not come from military power, but from dialogue. He did not impose himself with weapons, but with promises. He did not build an empire, yet achieved what empires never could: bringing Israel and its enemies to the same table. That coincidence has led many scholars to consider that the verse may have a dual fulfillment, one historical and another contemporary, a second fulfillment unfolding before our very eyes. The clearest parallel is the covenant itself, and the 2025 agreement represents exactly that: a multinational coalition, with Israel at the center and multiple Arab, European, and Western nations united under one resolution. It is not a local treaty, but a global alliance built around the stability of the Middle East, the most sensitive region on the planet. Never before in modern history has a single accord brought together so many interests, religions, and systems under one shared goal. And that is precisely the feature Daniel emphasized: a covenant with many. The second reflection lies in the nature of the leader. Daniel did not describe a tyrant, but a diplomat, someone who would confirm an existing covenant, not create a new one, someone who would strengthen and solidify what was already in motion. Kushner did not invent the idea of peace in the Middle East, but he turned it into a tangible reality. first through the Abraham Accords, and now through the 2025 Middle East Peace and Security Initiative. In both cases, he acted not as the initiator, but as the confirmer, and that very word confirm is exactly the one used in the original Hebrew text. It doesn't say create, it says make firm. The coincidence is too specific to ignore. A third parallel lies in the global impact. Daniel foresaw that the covenant would bring a temporary sense of peace before a time of great tribulation, a calm before the storm. And that is precisely what the world feels now. Markets are stabilizing. Governments are celebrating. Headlines are filled with hope. Yet beneath that calm surface, tension remains. Peace is real, but fragile. And the echo of prophecy reminds us, every peace without God is temporary. Scholars also point out another detail. Daniel wrote that the prince who is to come would arise from the people who destroyed Jerusalem, that is, from the lineage of the ancient Roman Empire. Today, the modern Western world, Europe, and the United States represents the political legacy of that same empire. And Kushner, born in the West, educated in its universities, and backed by its powers, fits within that historical framework. This is not about assigning prophetic identities, but about recognizing patterns, because prophecy rarely reveals names. It reveals structures that repeat themselves. The mirror also reflects a deeper spiritual dimension. Daniel did not only speak of politics, but of an order that would attempt to unite the world under a false sense of harmony. And that is exactly what we are witnessing. Nations seeking a common system, a global economy, a shared digital currency, a unified narrative of progress and cooperation. The language of modern leaders is filled with phrases like global unity, shared agenda, and collective security. It is not coincidence. It is the spirit of the age moving in the same direction the prophetic text foresaw. However, prophecy does not end with the covenant. Daniel adds a warning. In the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. This implies a future rupture, a moment when the apparent peace will collapse. Many theologians believe that point has not yet arrived, but that the stage is already set for it to unfold. The foundations are laid. The alliances are signed. The players are on the stage. All that remains is for the prophetic clock to mark its next movement. And the unsettling truth is that all signs indicate that clock has already started ticking again. For believers, this is not a cause for fear, but for discernment. Prophecy was never given to terrify, but to warn. And recent events serve as a reminder that history follows a divine script. Every generation has its moment of revelation, and ours seems to be living it now. While the powers of the world celebrate a peace treaty, heaven observes the fulfillment of God's word with mathematical precision. For what the world calls diplomacy, God calls fulfillment. The mirror of Daniel not only shows us the present, it also exposes the heart of humanity, its endless desire to build its own salvation apart from the divine. From ancient kingdoms to modern conferences, mankind continues to seek peace without the Prince of Peace. And that is precisely the error prophecy sought to reveal. The 2025 covenant may be a political achievement, but spiritually, it is a reminder that true reconciliation can only come from heaven, not from the signatures of men. Thus, every word of Daniel now resounds louder than ever, not as a distant warning, but as a mirror before the modern world. Prophecy is no longer a story of the past. It is the reflection of the present. And while leaders celebrate at international summits, the children of God must lift their eyes and discern the times. Because earthly covenants may promise security, but only the eternal covenant brings redemption. Jerusalem has once again become the center of the world stage. Every pact, every speech, every signature seems to move the hands of the prophetic clock. Humanity celebrates stability, but heaven sees fulfillment, Men seek human mediators, but only Christ is the true mediator between God and men. Treaties offer temporary truces, but only the covenant of the Lamb brings eternal redemption. The year 2025 will be remembered not merely as the year of a political treaty, but as the year when prophecy began to take shape before our very eyes. The pens of leaders signed an agreement, but in heaven, another hand wrote, "The time has been fulfilled." Subscribe to Between Heaven and Earth to keep discovering how today's history confirms the eternal word. May God's blessing be with you.